The October sun painted the horizon in golden hues as Marina and Felipe returned from their last journey as a childless couple. The speedometer read 50 miles per hour on the highway, while the radio softly played a song that always made them smile. It was a perfect moment, the kind that gets etched in memory before everything changes completely. Marina adjusted her seatbelt over her 38-week belly, feeling the now familiar little movements. After 3 years of trying to conceive, every kick in turn was celebrated as a small miracle. She smiled, lovingly running her hand over her prominent belly, thinking about how their lives were about to change. "I think she's restless today," Marina commented, turning to Felipe with a smile. "Must be eager to meet her daddy." Felipe kept his eyes on the road, but his smile widened. "Just 2 more weeks and our princess will be here," he responded, reaching out to briefly touch his wife's belly. It was a gesture that had become automatic over the past months, a small ritual of connection with the daughter they hadn't met yet. The weekend had been perfect. Marina's parents' beach house had provided the ideal refuge for their last days of peace before the baby's arrival. They talked about the future, finalized the last details of the nursery, and enjoyed moments of tranquility by the sea. It was as if the universe was granting them one final gift before the big change in their lives. But fate had other plans for that afternoon. The first sign that something was wrong came as a sharp pang that made Marina straighten in her seat. She breathed deeply, trying not to show concern. After all, there had been so many false alarms in recent weeks. But then came the second pang, stronger than the first, followed by a wet sensation that left no doubt. "Felipe," she called, trying to keep her voice steady, "I think my water just broke." The car continued straight for a few seconds as if Felipe hadn't heard. But Marina noticed the change. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel and his posture stiffened. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, as if coming from far away. "No," he said, almost in a whisper. "It can't be now." "Felipe, I'm sure," Marina insisted, feeling panic beginning to rise in her chest. "We need to get to the hospital." That's when everything changed. Felipe's face, always so gentle and controlled, transformed into a mask of pure terror. His eyes widened, and beads of sweat began forming on his forehead. The car started losing speed, drifting erratically toward the shoulder. "No, no, no," he repeated like a desperate mantra. "This isn't happening again." Marina didn't understand the last part, "again?" But before she could question it, the car came to an abrupt stop on the shoulder. Felipe unfastened his seatbelt with frantic movements, his hands visibly shaking. "Felipe, what are you doing?" Marina asked, fear now evident in her voice. "We need to get to the hospital, the baby." But he was already out of the car, coming around to the passenger door. When he opened it, his eyes were unrecognizable. There was something wild in them, something Marina had never seen before in their 15 years together. "Get out of the car," he ordered in a voice that didn't sound like his own. "What? Have you lost your mind?" Marina protested, clutching her seatbelt as another contraction hit her. What happened next would be forever etched in Marina's memory like a slow-motion nightmare. Felipe, the man who had promised to protect her forever, grabbed her arms forcefully and pulled her out of the car. She stumbled, leaning against the vehicle's side as she watched, stunned, her husband return to the driver's seat. But he was already closing the door. The engine roared, and within seconds the car disappeared around the bend, leaving Marina alone on the shoulder, her contractions growing stronger and more frequent. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky with the same golden hues as moments before. But now, instead of a perfect moment, Marina was living her worst nightmare. Alone, in labor, without a phone, and unable to comprehend how her world had crumbled in a matter of minutes. Tears blurred her vision as she sat down on the roadside grass, trying to process what had just happened. How could the man who had cried with joy at seeing the first ultrasound abandon her like this? How could the husband who spent hours talking to her belly leave her alone at such a crucial moment? Marina didn't know it, but her story was just beginning. And the phone call she was about to receive would change everything again. The first 5 minutes alone on the shoulder were pure shock. Marina could barely believe this was really happening. The contractions came in increasingly frequent waves, and she desperately tried to remember the breathing techniques she'd learned in childbirth classes. Traffic on the highway was sparse at this hour, and the few cars that passed continued on their way without even slowing down. The sun continued its relentless path toward the horizon, and shadows began to lengthen around her. Marina had never felt so vulnerable and alone. 1, 2, 3. She counted mentally during each contraction, trying to maintain control. The fear wasn't just about the imminent birth, but also about her complete lack of help. Her phone had been left in the car, along with her purse and all her documents. It was as if Felipe had taken not just the car, but her entire sense of security and stability. 10 minutes passed and Marina began to evaluate her options. She could try walking until she found help, but the contractions were becoming too strong to allow her to move safely. Besides, she had no idea how long it would take to find civilization. The last sign she'd seen indicated 9 miles to the next town. "Help!" she shouted several times, but her voice seemed too small against the noise of cars occasionally passing by. Each vehicle that appeared on the horizon brought new hope, which quickly turned to disappointment when it continued on without stopping. 15 minutes after being abandoned, Marina began to feel something different. The contractions were changing pattern, becoming more intense and rhythmic. Panic began to take hold when she realized that the birth might actually happen right there, alone on the roadside. "Please, my love, wait just a little longer," she whispered, caressing her belly. "Daddy will come back. He has to come back." But would he really? The doubt ate at her inside. How could Felipe do this to her? To them? 15 years together, 3 years trying to conceive, 9 months of anticipation. Everything seemed to have been thrown away in a moment of inexplicable madness. Memories of recent months flashed through her mind like a fast-forward film. Felipe painting the nursery in the pink shades she'd chosen. The nights he stayed awake reading stories to her belly. The way his eyes sparkled when he talked about their daughter-to-be. None of it matched the man who had abandoned her minutes ago. 18 minutes after being abandoned, Marina heard a sound that made her heart stop for a second. It was her ringtone. The sound came from an approaching car and she recognized it immediately. It was Felipe returning. But the car drove straight past, leaving only the echo of the familiar ringtone fading in the distance. It was like being abandoned a second time, and Marina felt the tears return with renewed force. The disappointment was almost physical, like a pain adding to the increasingly intense contractions. And then, exactly 20 minutes after being left alone, her ringtone sounded again. This time the sound didn't pass. A car was stopping on the shoulder a few yards away. It was Felipe. When the phone rang for the third time, Marina saw her husband's figure getting out of the car. But something was different about him now. His movements were hesitant, almost fearful, and even from a distance she could see he was crying. "Helena," his voice trembled on the phone, almost unrecognizable. "Forgive me, I need to tell you something." Marina wanted to scream at him, wanted to demand explanations, but all she could say was, "Felipe, I need help." "The baby?" "My first wife," he interrupted her, the words rushing out as if he couldn't contain them anymore. "She died in childbirth 12 years ago. I never told you, but I was driving when it happened. I couldn't get to the hospital in time." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Marina felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. 12 years? First wife. How did she not know this? How had Felipe managed to hide something so significant all this time? The pieces started falling into place in her mind, the nightmares that sometimes woke him up sweating, his resistance to talking about certain aspects of his past, the inexplicable panic he showed when she mentioned childbirth. Everything made terrible sense now. "I panicked," he continued, his voice choked with tears. "When your water broke, that whole day came rushing back. The blood, the screams, the guilt. I couldn't bear it. But now I realize I'm doing it all over again. Please forgive me. I'm coming back to get you." Marina looked at her husband approaching her, staggering, his eyes red from crying. The man she knew was back, but now she also saw the scars he had hidden for so long. A new contraction hit her, stronger than all the previous ones, reminding her that there was no time to process all of this now. Their daughter was coming and they needed to act fast. Felipe ran to Marina, his legs shaking as much as his voice had moments before on the phone. When he reached her, he fell to his knees on the roadside grass, sobbing like a child. "Forgive me," he repeated through tears, "please forgive me." Marina wanted to scream at him, wanted to demand explanations about 12 years of secrets, wanted to understand how he could hide something so crucial about his life. But a particularly strong contraction prevented her from speaking. She doubled over in pain, instinctively grabbing Felipe's arm. The touch seemed to awaken something in him. In seconds, the broken man gave way to the Felipe she knew, practical, protective, decisive. He helped her up carefully, supporting much of her weight as they walked to the car. "We need to time the contractions," he said, helping her settle into the passenger seat. His hands were still shaking, but his voice was steadier. "How far apart are they?" "About 5 minutes, I think," Marina answered, trying to focus despite the pain. "They're getting stronger and closer together." Felipe started the car and accelerated carefully, maintaining a speed that balanced urgency and safety. The GPS showed 40 minutes to the nearest hospital. He knew every minute would be crucial. "Tell me about her," Marina suddenly asked between contractions. "Your first wife. I need to understand." Felipe swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the road as the memories he had tried to bury for so long came flooding back. "Her name was Clara," he began, his voice low but steady. "We met in college, married young. She got pregnant in our first year of marriage." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "It was a day like today coming back from a trip. We were far from home when she went into labor. I thought we had time to reach the hospital." Marina watched a solitary tear roll down her husband's cheek as he continued. "The labor started in the car. She was bleeding heavily, screaming in pain. I'd never felt so helpless. When we finally reached the hospital, it was too late. I lost them both, Clara and our son." "Why did you never tell me?" asked Marina, her voice softer now despite the pain of contractions. "At first, it was too hard to talk about," Felipe answered, wiping his eyes. "Then as time passed, it became harder to find the right moment. I convinced myself I'd moved on, that it was a story that could stay in the past. But today? Today you relived it all," Marina finished, finally understanding the depth of trauma her husband carried. The contractions continued intensely, now only 3 minutes apart. Marina tried to focus on breathing, but her mind was divided between the physical pain and the emotional pain she saw in Felipe's eyes. "It won't happen again," said Felipe as if answering his own thoughts. "This time will be different. I promise." The car cut through the falling night, and Felipe kept his eyes alternating between the road and the clock, mentally timing each of Marina's contractions. Each of her moans made his heart clench, bringing flashbacks of the past that he desperately tried to keep under control. "Felipe," Marina called, her voice tense, "I think she's coming. We won't make it to the hospital." Panic threatened to overtake him again, but this time Felipe fought against it. "We'll make it," he stated with a conviction he didn't really feel. "Just 20 more minutes. Breathe with me, love. Like we learned in class, remember?" He began guiding her breathing, exaggerating the movements so she could follow. It was ironic. In the childbirth classes he had been the most dedicated father, memorized all the techniques, asked all the questions. Now he understood that perhaps he had been trying to compensate for his previous failure, trying to ensure that this time everything would be perfect. "Tell me more," Marina asked between controlled breaths. "About you, about how you dealt with everything after." Felipe hesitated for a moment, but realized she was using the conversation as a distraction from the pain. "I moved to a different city," he continued. "I couldn't live there anymore where everything reminded me of them. I did therapy for a while but quit when I thought I was better. Threw myself into work, avoided serious relationships for years. Until I met you." Marina held his hand for a moment, squeezing it gently. "Why didn't you go back to therapy when we started trying to conceive?" "I thought I was ready," he admitted, guilt evident in his voice. "Convinced myself it was an old story, that it didn't affect me anymore. What an idiot I was." "No," Marina interrupted, her voice surprisingly strong despite the pain. "You were human. You carried this pain alone for so long, but now you're not alone anymore." Her words hit him hard, and Felipe felt more tears forming in his eyes. How could she, in the middle of labor after being abandoned by him, still find the strength to offer understanding? The hospital lights finally appeared on the horizon, and Felipe felt immense relief course through his body. They would make it. This time would be different. It had to be. The hospital parking lot was practically empty when Felipe pulled in, tires screeching on the cobblestones. Before he even came to a complete stop, doctors and nurses were already running toward them. The emergency room had been notified by phone during the drive. "Laboring mother, contractions every 2 minutes," one of the nurses quickly informed as she helped transfer Marina to a wheelchair. Her professional eyes assessed the situation in seconds. "Complete dilation, we need to take her immediately." Felipe tried to follow the gurney, but an older nurse with gray hair and a firm expression stopped him. "You need to fill out the paperwork first," she said, handing him a clipboard. "And change clothes if you want to enter the delivery room." His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. The forms seemed endless: full name, date of birth, medical history, allergies. Every second away from Marina was torture. The guilt of abandonment still weighed on his chest like an anchor. "Quickly, please," urged the nurse, observing his slowness. "Your wife needs you." The word wife hit him like a punch to the stomach. Memories of Clara mixed with the present reality, and for a moment Felipe felt the world spin. The nurse must have noticed something in his expression, because her tone softened considerably. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're very pale." Felipe felt the words escape before he could contain them. "My first wife died during childbirth," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. I can't go through that again." The nurse, her badge identified her as Dona Carmen, squeezed his shoulder more firmly. "Listen carefully," she said, her tone maternal but firm. "What happened before was a tragedy, but it doesn't define what will happen today. Marina needs you strong and present. Can you do that for her?" Something in Dona Carmen's voice reached him beyond the panic. Felipe nodded, taking a deep breath, and finished filling out the forms with slightly steadier hands. Then he was taken to change clothes, a ritual that seemed surreal in its simplicity. Green gown, cap, mask, shoe covers. Each piece of clothing was like armor preparing him for the battle ahead. When he entered the delivery room, Marina was already positioned, surrounded by an efficient and focused medical team. Her eyes found his immediately, and Felipe felt his heart clench seeing the fear mixed with relief in her gaze. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said between labored breaths. "I'll never abandon you again," he promised, taking her hand in his. Never again. The next 2 hours were an emotional roller coaster. Each contraction seemed to drain more energy from Marina, and Felipe felt torn between the desire to help and the paralyzing fear that something would go wrong. But this time he was determined to be strong for Marina, for his daughter, and for Clara's memory. "A little more, Mrs. Marina," the doctor encouraged. "The head is crowning." Felipe kept his eyes fixed on Marina's face, deliberately avoiding looking anywhere else. His greatest fear was seeing blood, the trigger that had unleashed so much trauma years ago. Instead, he focused on whispering words of encouragement, wiping sweat from her forehead, being the anchor she needed in that moment. "I can't anymore," Marina groaned after another push. "I'm so tired." "Yes, you can," Felipe responded with a firmness he didn't know he possessed. "You're the strongest person I know. Our daughter is almost here." As if responding to his words, a sharp, vigorous cry filled the room. Felipe felt his legs weaken at hearing that sound, so different from the devastating silence that had marked his past. "It's a beautiful, healthy girl," announced the doctor, lifting a small body covered in red and white. "Would you like to cut the cord, Daddy?" Felipe hesitated for a moment, but Marina's exhausted smile gave him courage. With trembling hands, he cut the umbilical cord, a symbolic act of connection and separation marking the beginning of a new life. When they placed the baby in Marina's arms, Felipe finally allowed himself to really look at his daughter. She was perfect, small, pink with a surprising amount of dark hair. Her tiny eyes squinted against the light, and her miniature fists waved in the air as if testing the limits of her new world. "Hi, Laura," Marina whispered, gently touching her daughter's face. They had chosen the name together months before, not knowing how much it would mean in this moment. Laura, meaning victorious. Felipe watched the scene with a lump in his throat. There they were, his two warriors, alive and well. The fear was still present, like a shadow in the corners of his mind, but for the first time in 12 years, it wasn't fear that dominated. It was hope. "Can I hold her?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Marina nodded, and with infinite care, they transferred the small bundle to his arms. The moment Laura nestled against his chest, something inside Felipe healed. Not completely, some wounds are too deep to fully heal, but enough for him to know that from that moment on, everything would be different. "Forgive me," he whispered, looking at Marina. "For everything." "I already have," she replied softly. "But we still have a lot to talk about." Felipe nodded, knowing the path ahead would be long and difficult. There would be painful conversations, tears to be shed, trust to be rebuilt. But now, holding his daughter in his arms, beside the woman who had shown strength and understanding beyond any expectation, he knew he was ready to face it all. In that moment, in the delivery room lit by fluorescent lights, 3 hearts beat in a new rhythm, the rhythm of hope, forgiveness, and new beginnings. The first days after Laura's birth were a complex mixture of joy and tension. The hospital room, with its pastel walls and constant hum of equipment, became a sanctuary where Felipe and Marina began to process everything that had happened. During the day, they took turns caring for Laura, learning together every small detail of the new routine. Felipe watched Marina breastfeeding, amazed at the naturalness with which she had taken on her role as mother, even after the trauma of the precipitous delivery. But it was during the nights that the most difficult conversations happened. "Why did you never mention Clara in all these years?" Marina asked one of those nights, while Laura slept peacefully in her hospital bassinet. 15 years together, Felipe. 15 years of secrets. Felipe sat in the companion chair, his deep dark circles evidencing sleepless nights. At the beginning of our relationship, the pain was still too fresh. He began, his voice low to avoid waking the baby. I could barely say her name aloud. Then it became increasingly difficult to find the right moment. There was no right moment, Marina replied, adjusting herself in the hospital bed. There was the necessary moment. When we started trying to conceive, for example. Or when we found out I was pregnant. I know, Felipe admitted, running his hands over his tired face. Every time you talked about childbirth, about your fears and expectations, I should have told you. But I was so afraid. Afraid of reliving everything, afraid of scaring you, afraid you'd see me differently. And it ended up happening in the worst possible way, Marina finished, her voice carrying a mixture of hurt and understanding. You abandoned me on the roadside, Felipe. Pregnant and in labor. The words hit Felipe like a punch to the stomach. He got up from the chair and walked to the window, watching the city lights twinkling in the night. I'll never forgive myself for that, he said, his voice choked. When I saw you in labor, it was like reliving that day. The fear completely overtook me. Laura stirred in her bassinet, making small sounds of protest. Marina reached out and calmed her with gentle touches. You need professional help, Felipe, she said after a moment. We can't move forward without properly dealing with this trauma. I know, he agreed, turning to look at his wife and daughter. I've already scheduled the first therapy session for next week. I can't risk something like this happening again. Marina nodded, approving the initiative. And us? Where do we stand? The question hung in the air for a few moments. Felipe sat back in the chair, leaning forward. I love you more than anything, Marina. You and Laura are my life now. I know I broke your trust, but I'm willing to do anything to earn it back. It will take time, she replied, her tone softer. Every time I close my eyes, I can still feel the fear of that moment, alone on the road. But I also remember you coming back, facing your demons to be by my side. Laura chose that moment to fully wake up, her small but determined cry filling the room. Felipe immediately stood to pick her up, his movements still a bit hesitant but full of affection. Hi, princess, he murmured, cradling his daughter against his chest. Daddy's here. Daddy will always be here now. Marina watched the scene with tearful eyes. It was difficult to reconcile the man who had abandoned her with the dedicated father she saw now, cradling their daughter with such love. But maybe that was the essence of life, accepting that people are complex, that they can carry both trauma and love in their hearts. We need to establish some rules, Marina finally said. First, total honesty from now on. No matter how difficult it is, we can't have any more secrets. Felipe nodded, still rocking Laura. I agree. And I'll stick with therapy until the end this time. I won't abandon treatment like I did before. Second, Marina continued, we need to learn to trust each other again. It will take time, but I want you to know that I'm willing to try. I want to try too, Felipe replied, his voice heavy with emotion. I'll prove every day that you can trust me again. Laura had calmed in her father's arms, her tiny eyes now closed in deep sleep. Felipe returned her to the bassinet with infinite care, as if she were made of the most precious material in the world. Third, said Marina, watching how carefully he handled their daughter, we need to honor Clara's memory in a healthy way. We can't let the past control our present, but we also can't pretend it doesn't exist. Felipe felt tears roll down his face hearing Clara's name pronounced by Marina with such respect. You're amazing, you know that? He said, sitting back down beside her. After everything I did, you can still have this understanding? It's not understanding, it's love, Marina replied, reaching out to dry his tears. And it's also survival instinct. We can't build our future on a foundation of secrets and unresolved fears. That night, while Laura slept peacefully and hospital sounds created a soft melody in the background, Felipe and Marina began rebuilding their story. It wouldn't be easy, the trauma and breach of trust had left deep scars. But there, in that hospital room with their daughter as a silent witness, they took their first steps toward healing. 6 months had passed since Laura's birth. It was a Saturday afternoon when Felipe parked the car in front of the municipal cemetery. Marina was in the passenger seat, holding Laura who slept peacefully in her lap. The silence inside the vehicle was heavy, laden with expectation and apprehension. Are you sure you want to do this? Marina asked softly, watching her husband who kept his hands tight on the steering wheel, even with the car already turned off. Felipe took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the cemetery's iron gate. "I need to do this," he answered. Dr. Carlos said that facing the past is a fundamental part of the healing process. "And you're right, we can't build our future pretending the past doesn't exist." The therapy sessions over the past months had been intense and transformative. Dr. Carlos, the trauma specialist therapist Felipe had sought out, suggested this visit as part of the closure process. It was the first time Felipe would return to Clara's grave since the funeral 12 years ago. They got out of the car slowly, as if each movement could break the fragile courage they had gathered to be there. Felipe carried a small bouquet of white lilies, Clara's favorite flowers, a detail he had shared with Marina during one of their long nighttime conversations. The path to the grave was both familiar and strange. The headstones passed like silent sentinels, mute witnesses to so many stories of love and loss. Felipe led the way, his steps hesitant but determined, while Marina followed a few steps behind, giving him the space she knew he needed. When they reached Clara's headstone, Felipe stopped abruptly. The white marble was slightly worn by time, but the words were still perfectly legible. "Clara Santos Silva, beloved wife and mother, her love will live forever in our hearts." "Hi, Clara," Felipe said, his voice trembling slightly as he knelt to place the flowers. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back." Marina watched in silence, cradling Laura, who was beginning to wake. There was something deeply moving about the scene, her husband, kneeling before the grave of his first love, finally facing the ghost that had haunted him for so long. "I brought some people to meet you," Felipe continued, turning to look at Marina and Laura. "This is Marina, my wife. And this is our daughter, Laura." As if understanding the importance of the moment, Laura opened her eyes, blinking sleepily. Felipe stood and took his daughter in his arms, approaching the headstone again. "I spent so much time afraid," he said, his voice steadier now. "Afraid to love again, afraid to be a father, afraid of reliving that terrible day. That fear almost destroyed everything again, Clara. I almost lost Marina and Laura the same way I lost you and our son." Marina felt tears rolling down her face as she watched husband and daughter. Felipe continued, "But now I understand that honoring your memory doesn't mean living in fear. It means finding the courage to love again, to be the father our son never had the chance to know, to build a new life without denying the importance of the old one." Laura made a small sound of contentment, reaching her tiny hands to touch her father's face. Felipe smiled through his tears, kissing his daughter's forehead. "Marina taught me that love doesn't have to be exclusive," he said, extending his free hand to his wife, who came closer and held it firmly. "That I can keep you in my heart and still have room for a new love, a new family. You'll always be part of our story," Marina added, her voice soft but firm. "Laura will grow up knowing about you, about how her father learned to be strong through pain, about how love can heal even the deepest wounds." Felipe looked at his wife with infinite gratitude. How could he be so lucky? How could he have found someone capable of not just accepting his past, but honoring it in this way? "I promise I won't run away anymore," he said, turning to the headstone one last time. "I'll be the man you always believed I could be, Clara. I'll be the father our Laura deserves, the husband Marina needs." The wind blew softly, making the lily petals dance in the air. It was as if nature itself was responding to his words, offering a silent blessing for this moment of healing and transformation. "It's time to go," Felipe said after a few minutes of contemplative silence. "But it won't be another 12-year goodbye. We'll return other times as a family." As they walked back to the car, Felipe felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The fear was still there, probably always would be at some level, but it wasn't the uncontrollable monster it had been. It was just a part of his story, a scar that had made him stronger, more compassionate, more human. Laura fell asleep again during the drive home, her peaceful little face reflecting the peace that was beginning to settle in the family. Marina was driving this time, allowing Felipe to process his emotions in silence. "Thank you," he finally said, breaking the silence. "For today, for everything." Marina smiled, her eyes meeting his briefly before returning attention to the road. "We're a family," she replied simply. "We face everything together now." And so, on that Saturday afternoon, a new page was turned. The past wasn't forgotten, but finally found its proper place, no longer as a threatening shadow over the present, but as an honored part of a larger story, a story of love, loss, courage, and above all, redemption. 2 years had passed since that fateful afternoon on the road. Laura, now a bright and cheerful little girl, ran through the garden of their new house, her dark curls bouncing in the wind as she chased soap bubbles that Felipe was blowing. Marina watched them from the porch, a coffee cup in her hands and a serene smile on her lips. Moving to this house had been a joint decision, part of the process of building something new, truly theirs. It was a spacious house with a generous backyard where Laura could play, and an office that Felipe had transformed into his healing space, a place where he kept his memories both old and new in a healthy and organized way. "Daddy, more?" Laura shouted, jumping to reach the bubbles floating above her head. Felipe laughed, blowing another sequence of iridescent bubbles that danced in the morning air. Marina watched the scene with a full heart. The therapy sessions had worked wonders for Felipe. He still had his difficult moments, especially on significant dates or when something reminded him of that terrible day, but now he knew how to handle his triggers in a healthy way. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first months after Laura's birth were especially challenging. There were sleepless nights, painful conversations, moments of doubt and fear. Marina also needed professional help to process the trauma of abandonment and rebuild her trust in her husband. But every step of the way had been worth it. Seeing Felipe now playing carefree with their daughter was like witnessing a daily miracle. The man haunted by the past had given way to a present and loving father, an attentive and honest husband. "It's time," Marina reminded, checking her watch. Felipe nodded, picking Laura up. "Should we visit Aunt Clara, princess?" Laura clapped her hands, excited. For her, the monthly cemetery visits were natural, part of her family routine. Felipe and Marina had decided to always be honest with her about his past, adapting the explanations as she grew and began to understand more. In the car, Laura chatted happily in her car seat, talking about the drawing she had made to leave at Clara's grave. It was a tradition she had created herself. Every month she brought a new drawing, usually full of vibrant colors and cheerful figures. "Will Aunt Clara like this one?" she asked, showing the paper full of flowers and hearts. "She'll love it, my love," Felipe replied, his voice soft and controlled. "Did you know Aunt Clara always loved bright colors?" The cemetery was no longer a place of sadness for them. They had transformed the visits into moments of celebrating life, of connecting past and present. Laura ran between the headstones without fear, occasionally stopping to admire a flower or comment on an interesting statue. As they walked to the family grave, Felipe held Marina's hand firmly. It was no longer the desperate grip of someone drowning in their fears, but the secure touch of someone who had found their safe harbor. "Hi, Aunt Clara," Laura exclaimed, running ahead to place her drawing next to the fresh flowers. "I brought a new drawing for you." Felipe knelt beside his daughter, helping her arrange the paper so the wind wouldn't take it. "What did you draw this time, princess?" "Our family," she replied proudly. "Look, this is you, this is Mommy, this is me, and this is Aunt Clara in heaven watching over us." Marina felt tears forming in her eyes, seeing the innocence and wisdom in her daughter's words. Laura had found her own way to integrate the complex history of her family into something beautiful and meaningful. "And this baby here?" Felipe asked, pointing to a smaller figure in the drawing. Laura smiled, that smile that lit up her whole little face. "It's the new baby. Like you and Mommy said is growing in the tummy?" Felipe stood up quickly, turning to Marina with wide eyes. She hadn't told him yet, she was waiting for the right moment, perhaps after the cemetery visit. But Laura, with her childlike perception, had picked up on the subtle changes in her mother over the past few days. "Are you?" he asked, his voice barely containing the emotion. Marina nodded, smiling through tears. "I found out yesterday. I was going to tell you tonight." Felipe hugged her tightly, and Laura ran to join the family embrace. There, before Clara's grave, a new chapter was beginning to unfold. There was no more fear, only gratitude, gratitude for love that heals, forgiveness that liberates, life that always finds a way to move forward. "See, Aunt Clara," said Laura, her childish voice full of joy. "Our family is growing." The wind blew softly, stirring the flowers on the grave and making Laura's drawing dance lightly. It was as if Clara was smiling too, blessing this moment of pure joy and unconditional love. Felipe looked at his family, Marina, Laura, the baby on the way, and then at Clara's headstone. His heart was at peace. He finally understood that it was possible to carry the past without being its prisoner, to love deeply without fear, and to build a bright future on the foundation of all his experiences, both painful and happy. "Thank you," he whispered, not knowing exactly to whom, to Clara for being his first love, to Marina for her infinite strength and understanding, to Laura for her healing joy, or to life itself, which in its mysterious wisdom, had woven all these stories into a tapestry of love, loss, courage, and redemption. The sun was setting when they left the cemetery, painting the sky with the same golden hues as that fateful afternoon 2 years ago. But now, instead of fear and despair, their hearts were full of hope and gratitude. The cycle was complete, and a new one was beginning, not as a repetition of the past, but as a continuation of a love story that transcended time, pain, and even death. It was the beginning of a new chapter, written with the inks of truth, forgiveness, and unconditional love. And this time they all knew they would face any challenge together, as the family they were always meant to be. Hey everyone, what did you think of this emotional roller coaster of a story? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of love, loss, and redemption, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Life Stories. Your support helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you more powerful stories like this one. See you in the next story.